Excellencies, distinguished delegate, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the President of the Economic and Social Council, who sadly have to leave because of an unexpected commitment, I extend my deepest gratitude for your presence today and her regret for not being able to be here today. I welcome you to the 9th Sustainable Investment Fair. The gathering is a unique opportunity to bring vision, commitment, and action toward finances for sustainable development goals. Our work today stands at a crucial juncture. Trillions of dollars in public and private funds are needed to realize a more sustainable future. Our collective focus and momentum toward achieving many SDGs had sadly been blown off course. The recent pandemic, climate change, and mounting geopolitical tensions have exacerbated socio-economic fragilities. In navigating these turbulent times, multiple avenues for dialogue and partnership are needed. The importance of global platforms that can connect all stakeholders around the boosting investment in SDGs, such as this fair, cannot be overstated. While investor interest in sustainable finance has grown markedly over the past decades, only a small percentage of global assets under management, less than 5% of the fund market in 2023, can currently be characterized as being sustainable funds. The fair promotes sustainable investment in emerging markets and aims to harness the power of sustainable investment for driving transformative change on the ground. Excellencies and colleagues, your contribution will inform and shape our approach to mobilizing resources, fostering partnership, and implementing a strategy that are both innovative and inclusive. As we convene today, let us remember the importance of partnership and meaningful private sector engagement as one key ingredient to bridge the SDG financing gap. In closing, I urge each one of you to embrace this unique opportunity to contribute to a more sustainable and prosperous world. Let this look back in time over this fair as being an important catalyst for reaching the 2030 agenda. Thank you for your dedication and your action. Together we can and will make a difference. Thank you. And now I will give the floor to Undersecretary Mr. Lee. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Excellencies, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm pleased to welcome you all to the launch of this year's Sustainable Development Goals Investment Fair. This event has grown and evolved over the years into a dynamic space for germinating concrete opportunities to advance and accelerate the SDG from the ground up. Every one of the investment opportunities featured here has potential to generate a combination of the financial, economic, and social dividends. Collectively, over $10 billion of investment can be mobilized through these efforts. Countries will showcase strategic national investment priorities over the course of the week. For example, Ecuador is seeking to construct a new toll road to open trade access for small businesses. In Serbia, construction of a biotech innovation hub aims to propel the startups and skills development. Colombia is seeking to finance its largest greenfield offshore wind energy project. This is just a small sample. We hope that over the next 3 days, this investment fair will lead to new collaborations between the financiers, businesses, and the governments, with the common purpose of achieving SDGs. At the same time, we recognize that investing in the SDGs is not only about directing monetary capital. It is also about harnessing political, social, and human capital more efficiently to address the mounting challenges we face. Throughout the course of the fair, discussions will cover the areas such as sovereign green and social bonds insurance, public and private partnerships for sustainable infrastructure, financial regulatory frameworks, and enabling policy frameworks to crowding private investment for sustainable development. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, countries everywhere are accelerating their efforts to find technological solutions and business models that can ensure more prosperous, sustainable, and equitable societies. Let us harness the collective intelligence and resources of this gathering to help identify those solutions and to drive the SDG investment. Together, we can and we must channel the resources we need and build the capacities to make the sustainable development a reality for our people and our planet. In closing, I assure you that UNDESA, my small department, will continue to extend its full support to countries in driving the momentum for sustainable and resilient solutions for all. The Sustainable Development Goals will continue to guide all our efforts. The insights and the seeds of the collaboration that you planned this week will be invaluable as we progress towards a fourth international conference on financing for development to be hosted by SPAN in 2025. We congratulate the countries that have facilitated the development of these projects for this fair to advance a more inclusive and sustainable future. And certainly, we look forward to the even more engagement on the road to FFD4 next year. I thank you.
I would like to thank Mr. Lee for your statement, and now I would like to give the floor to Nadia Calviño, President of the European Investment Bank. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yes, I am Nadia Calviño. I'm President of the European Investment Bank Group, which is one of the largest multilateral development institutions in the world. And this is my first time at the UN. So I am absolutely delighted that my first time in this so important building, so important seance for all of us, has to do with one of the most important challenges of our time: mobilizing public and private finance for those things that matter the most: people and our planet. So thank you very much for the organization. And I am quite happy to be able to share with you some of the elements that have been guiding our actions in this area. We have been strongly supporting the Sustainable Development Goals from the very start. Actually, every project that we finance is contributing to one or more of the Sustainable Development Goals because we're strongly convinced that they are our compass to build a better future for younger generations. They're actually part of the European Investment Bank's DNA, explicitly taken into account into all European policies, and we have actually been tracking and reporting on the fulfillment of each one of these objectives since 2016. For example, we know that we signed last year 2.4 billion euros for projects outside the EU to support good health and well-being. That's the Sustainable Development Goal 3. 1.6 billion euros for clean water and sanitation, Sustainable Development Goal 6, and more than 4 billion euros for clean, affordable energy, Development Goal number 7. Behind these large figures are concrete projects that are shaping and changing the lives of people on the ground. Just last week, at the spring meetings of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, we signed a new investment with Bhutan to connect remote communities to renewable energy sources, which will in turn enable people to have access to public services. You were, dear Undersecretary, you were talking about not only monetary capital, but also human capital being of the essence when we look towards the future. Well, actually, We also have an agreement with Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to step up our partnership to empower women and girls around the world, especially in the area of maternal health and family planning. And with Dr. Tedros, I had a meeting also last week of the World Health Organization, and we shared the ambitious calendar we have to rid the world of polio for good. Today's Sustainable Development Goal Investment Fair, I think, provides us with a very good platform to see how to mobilize the necessary investment to reach these ambitious goals, engaging the energy, the capital, the creativity of the private sector. I was just discussing with a colleague that was telling me it's not a matter of catalyzing the private sector. The private sector is extremely mobilized and interested in development finance. It is very high on the radar screen of world's multilateral development banks, how to deepen our partnership with the private sector and ensure that we can raise the necessary investments for these very ambitious goals. And we have indeed been discussing with other members of the Multilateral Development Bank family how to deepen and reinforce these partnerships. For example, via scaling up local currency lending and foreign exchange hedging solutions to de-risk private investment. Another promising area is to share and expand the data on risks and opportunities in emerging markets. The 20 multilateral development banks that are part of this global emerging markets risk database, known as GEMS, will now publish regularly default and recovery statistics. And this is extremely valuable information for public and private investors to take informed decisions and manage their risks in a more efficient manner. In parallel, we will continue to look into more creative manners to support private sector sustainable development goal-related investments. For example, the 2X challenge that I'm sure you're all very familiar with, which was launched by the G7 in 2018, aims to mobilize investments for the empowerment of women around the world. The European Investment Bank is one of the 20 fellow development finance institutions to give incentives to private sector banks in developing countries to support business-owned or led or largely employing women around the world. And it's been a huge success. The 2X challenge is now a global standard for gender lens investing. It has actually by far exceeded its targets, registering some $27.7 billion in investment to benefit hundreds of businesses in emerging economies since 2018. And it is not just our financing capacity that will attract investors in the private sector into projects that deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals. I think that the high environmental, social, and governance standards that we can bring to our operations can also help mobilize private investments and also build confidence. And I am extremely proud, not only that the European Investment Bank Group is a proud member of the Multilateral Development Bank family, but that only last week the ESG rating agency Sustainalytics has ranked the European Investment Bank as #1 in the 2024 ESG risk report issued last week, as I was saying. And this puts us #1 of 1,057 banks that have been ranked. High global sustainability standards are undoubtedly a very powerful driver and mobilizer of private finance in themselves. Final word on partnership. I think today's discussion is actually all about partnership. The UN is all about partnership, isn't it? And achieving the Sustainable Development Goals is a global challenge. And we can only raise to that challenge by working in a spirit of cooperation, partnership. And we already have very successful exchanges and very successful examples of our work together that should inspire us. And I really want to close with these positive examples because many times we're talking about the challenges and we're currently surrounded by so many catastrophes and so many dramatic situations around the world that sometimes we lose sight of the many challenges that we are able to overcome working together and the many successful examples on which we can build going forward. For example, the COVAX facility, which we, the European Investment Bank, funded alongside Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, UNICEF, and others. We were able to deliver nearly 2 billion COVID vaccine doses to 146 countries and averted an estimated 2.7 million deaths. I mean, no country, no institution or company could have achieved such a result on its own. Our cooperation with the Vaccine Alliance is also enabling the establishment of vaccine production facilities in Africa, contributing to a healthier and also a more resilient, peaceful world. We're making very good progress. There's still a long way to go to meet our goals, so let's use this Sustainable Development Goals investment fair to talk, to work, to solve problems, and to invest together to achieve those ambitious goals. I look forward and I wish you a very productive discussion. I look forward to seeing the progress at next year's fair, and as you rightly pointed out, I think we should all remember that the future is not written. It will depend on what we do and our decisions taken now. And I hope that in the future, when we look back to this event and the many exchanges and projects we are launching in the area of developing finance now, we are proud to look back and see that we took the right decisions, we launched the right actions, and we marked important milestones for a better world. Let me close on this idea, and I wish you a very productive discussion going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Nadiño, and for this very inspired statement. And with this positive note, I would like to close this opening segment and take a few minutes while we reorganize the podium. Thank you.
Okay, bye now. Sure, do you have a particular order? Oh, here, your name is right here. Okay. Which I thought was a pretty useful thing to start off with. And then I was thinking that, Monica and Samir were probably talking about the official sector first, I think is better first. And then I could kind of give the private sector approach. Because he's actually going to make reference to a couple of things that we might be doing. And they're very much involved with it. So that's fine. Yeah. And you guys are in this too, in the task force. Very nice to meet you. Yeah, our task force on the development impact disclosure task force. I think you are. Yeah, that's good. I'll start with him, not start with you. No, but I think I have heard about it. Yeah. Well, maybe after we finish this session, you'll join.
Hi, everybody. So thank you all for being here for this high-level panel and the opening panel of the investment fair. It's really a pleasure to be here with the panelists that are here, one of whom I met 30 years ago or more.
We're not going to talk about it.
And then other close friends we've become friends more recently. So I will just want to say that, as you know, the Financing for Sustainable Development report just came out last week, and it really highlighted that there's a $4 trillion investment gap annually for developing countries to meet the SDGs. And it also really underscored the finance divide, that wealthy countries have access to finance at affordable terms, but many developing countries really have very limited access to affordable finance, and particularly those that are heavily indebted. And yet, at the same time, the best way for countries to get out of a debt trap is to actually invest and grow, but those same countries are unable to borrow at affordable terms to invest. So one of the real highlights in thinking that is going on now is that there needs to be an investment push. And that was one of the conclusions of the FSDR, and it's also the conclusion of the Secretary General in his SDG stimulus. There are sometimes people look at those numbers and say, well, we don't have enough public money, so let's look to private money. And I think that we've always tried to frame that a little bit differently, that private money has its own incentive structure. It's looking for for maximizing returns on a risk-adjusted basis. And public money is really there in part to maximize the public good, and whatever specific goals are associated with it, subject to not losing money, subject to being more or less profitable. And so it's not one or the other. You actually need both. And they have different types of, because they have different mandates, they have different ways of working together, and we need to have both public and private resources. The Addis Ababa Action Agenda from 2015 really, this was sort of the underlying thinking behind the agenda, that we need all sorts of financing, and they all have different roles to play. And it also was a place where it really put forward the idea of using public funds, a very old idea, but in the current context of using public funds to leverage private finance. And yet, since 2015, as we heard from the opening comments, only around $213 billion in capital has been mobilized by blended finance so far. But that's far below the trillions projected to be unlocked a decade ago. And that most of that money has bypassed the countries that need it the most, countries with the highest risk. And so one of the questions that we're all thinking about now is what has to happen to change that? And at the same time, there have been many efforts that have happened in the past 10 years, some of whom are sitting on this table, that have been building up to actually address this question. And then the question is, going forward, what else needs to happen to change this trajectory? And the SDG Investment Fair brings together both public and private voices to have this conversation. We're very lucky here to have the Finance in Commons, which is a group that brings together public development banks, regional development bank, and then a private development bank, as well as a private sector company, to bring different perspectives to this conversation. I think there are two questions. One is what it takes to increase investment in the SDGs and in developing countries, and the other is how do we better align this investment with the SDGs? What is the investment in SDG investment thesis? What does it mean to do so? What sectors would that focus on? And what about measuring and reporting to be able to understand what the impact of that is? And then, of course, how has this been changing over time since Addis Ababa 10 years ago? Because the outcome of this discussion is really meant to be in 2025, as you've all been hearing, the fourth International Conference on Financing for Development will take place in Spain, and the agreements, international agreements and global norms and global thinking on this will be updated. And so all of the outcomes and thinking from these discussions are really meant to be inputs for that discussion leading up to 2025. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our panel, and I'm going to start with Mr. Adama Mariko, who's the Secretary General of Finance and Commons.
Thank you very much, Shari. Thanks to all my co-panelists. and thanks to the audience. I just want to take this opportunity to also commend the work you have done in the FFD report. I started checking out, and it's really impressive, the amount of data that is disclosed there. I think it's really helpful for all the work we are doing in our institutions. Just coming back from the spring meetings in Washington, and I may say the movement we are seeing on having the multilateral development banks collaborating is really something that we were expecting for a long time. So seeing this is quite bringing optimism in the fact that, you know, the collaboration and the partnership we were expecting should happen now. You are speaking about the finance divide, and we often say about the fact that there is too many fragmentation within the finance, public finance space. This is something really that we should keep pushing, and I think the UN have a clear role on also enhancing that and help those institutions to keep collaborating and work out the system. But the system should go beyond the MDBs. That's actually one of the points we have. If you look at the reports on official data on climate finance, for instance, we are speaking of the needs, you mentioned trillions, but in 2022, for instance, MDBs accumulated and declared 60 billion on climate finance. If you look at a group of some banks that are not MDBs at some point, within the IDFC club. IDFC is the International Development Finance Club. It's a group of 26 national development banks and regional banks. They have declared 288 billion of climate finance. So at some point, let's look at the whole financial system as, MDBs and regional and national development banks that work in their countries sometime and don't have any international activity. So we are speaking about 530 public development banks in the world, and those national development banks have the same shareholders than the MDBs. At some point, we are also speaking about how to align their mandates to have a coherence in this international financial system. So why we are speaking about that as well? So mainly we hear, these numbers about we are looking for trillions. But every year, if you take those 530 public development banks, they annually commit and bring in the financial system 2.5 trillion. And this is not pledges. That's typically what they are signing in their books every year. So one part of the solutions on the trillion we are looking for are there. And I think one part of the problem is how we make sure that those 2.5 trillion are aligned. Probably that's where we should also look at these numbers and see how typically we can help those national development banks to get more and more focused on SDG mission and probably a sustainable dedicated mission. Collaboration with other stakeholders is obviously what we need. So that's what we do within the Financial Common Coalition, based on also the regional associations of public development banks, and also linking with the MDBs to have this global platform for PDBs. But this is not just to advocate on how the public development banks can foster their role under SDGs. It's also to look at the business models of those banks. While we say about stretching the balance sheet of the MDBs, it's also enhancing the financial capacity of the national development banks at some point. For them to be more able to implement their principal mandate, which is building in their countries the capacity for the private sector to invest. Because they are policy banks working with the government, they know better the financial system in their area, and they can also help the private sector to be, more qualified and to receive actually international investors. So, how do we do that? So, obviously, the collaboration between public development banks, but also the technical work we should engage with, other partners like export credit agencies, the private sector banks within the G funds, sharing norms, discussing with regulators on also how to be sure that the regulation is not creating fragmentation. I come from Europe. Actually, I am based within AFD, and we are a development bank in France where 100% of our commitments are aligned, but we cannot declare into the EU taxonomy somehow, because it's written in a way that it doesn't count as sustainable finance in Europe. Actually, it's 100 sustainable finance, and we're talking about 12 billion a year. So let's start with there. I think also I'm really eager to hear from my co-panelists and can follow up on what concrete work you are doing, at the National Development Bank perspective to help the private finance and the private sector to invest.
Thank you. Thanks, Adama. And one sort of a note on the Finance and Commons, because I think it started in the during the Addis Ababa conference,
Exactly.
and has grown so exponentially since then, and is really, when you look at this idea of bringing the entire system together, and if you can leverage one balance sheet by better using it, then you certainly can diversify a lot more across the entire world. And are there mechanisms to think about how does one better use the entire development bank system to be able to increase investment, and also the idea that national development banks, when we talk about leveraging private finance, in some cases, some of the more interesting things are really happening on the national level. And so one of the other thoughts is the importance of learning from all of these examples, to learn how to better, to take those examples and share them, not just from the multilateral to the national, but also from the national experiments to the regional and multilateral. And so with that, I'd like to give the floor to our second panelist, Mr. Zamir Iqbal, who's Vice President and CFO of the Islamic Development Bank.
Thank you, Chair. I think we all realize that SDG financing the challenges have increased, especially because of the COVID. The funding gap which is needed have increased quite a bit. So this is on the radar of all the MDBs, and I will reiterate what Nadia said earlier in the opening talking, that during the spring meetings, all the MDBs did meet, and this issue was brought up as a very high priority, that what can be done to bring the private capital for development. Now, when we talk about private capital, I would look at this problem as two prongs. One is, in general, how to bring private capital into a developing country and how to attract the private capital. Second is, how do you do that particularly for SDGs? And how do we innovate to make SDG finance as a separate asset class? Because remember that I'm looking at from our perspective, we have 57 member countries. 29 of these member countries are IDA recipient, which means they cannot receive any financing as such, even from the MDB, but other than a concessional financing. So that makes the challenges much bigger, much profound. So we have to bring this issue of how to mobilize even concessional finance. Of course, private sector is not interested in doing a private in a concessional finance way. So I think the way the MDBs are approaching this thing, first of all, how do we make a enabling environment for the private sector to come for a development in any developing country? That's in general what needs to be done. And of course, that requires a couple of areas which has been identified. One of them is that there is a lack of even clarity on regulation and the policies. And these needs to be much well defined so that the private capital can come in. Second issue is, of course, the exposure to the FX and also trying to have a long-term financing and requiring financial innovation in the form of guarantees by the MDBs or some other development partners. So that part is very important. Other key part which plays an important role is having a very robust monitoring and reporting reporting framework and have a very standard taxonomy, how to even measure or report this. And I think in that case, the World Bank is working on a scorecard, trying to standardize things. They are even working on standardizing the policies and procedures so that MDBs could go in collectively as a form of a partnership and bring. And I think that reminds me that, during the spring meetings, the World Bank also announced this global country platform for co-financing, which means all the projects which are for development, those will be listed on that platform, and anyone, any MDB and other interested parties could come in. That gives them a one place where all the information about the project is given in a very transparent fashion. So I think, plus I also earlier mentioned that World Bank has initiated this private sector innovation lab where they are trying to bring private sector perspective, hearing from them that what can be done. So I think the MDBs are, there are a couple of kind of things which are very well known, that MDBs are more than ever working together. They work on collaborative, they're trying to work on as one system. They all realize that we need to bring private sector in. They all realize that it's not easy to bring private sector, and we need help of the national governments. We need the help of the countries to make sure that they have an enabling environment. So MDBs will play their role to make sure that the ecosystem is there as in place, and so the idea is that we can attract. And I think last thing which we kind of a challenge which we see, I think there is a growing awareness or a different class of investors which are in the form of impact investors. They are not profit maximizer. They looked at impact, and they see that how we can maximize the impact. Either it is a part of their ESG agenda or as a their sustainability agenda. So I think that hopefully that investor class needs to be attracted more. They need to have a work with the MDBs together to make sure that MDBs who have a local knowledge, they have the boots on the ground, they have the regional offices, they know the development much better. So with that, many of the impact investor can delegate the monitoring to the MDBs, and that's how we can bring some of that private capital, either direct as a project finance or through our capital market interventions like a green bonds or sustainability bonds or impact bonds. I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much. And it's very interesting to think about the role of impact investors because their size is very small. But there also may be, if they're willing to take more risk, can they be brought into certain structures, some of them where they could be willing to take higher risk within the same structure that other investors that are not impact investors, and I'm looking over to one, I think, is would be able to think about. So with that, the next speaker is Daniel Zellico, who's the chairman and governing board of the J.P. Morgan Development Finance Institution. And this is really a private sector, probably the only private sector development bank. Right, so, right.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks very much, Sherry. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you for hosting us and to the organizers for inviting me. So I'm very glad that I'm speaking third, because all three of you have touched on issues which I think are vital to the foundation and the logic behind the foundation of J.P. Morgan's Development Finance Institution. Let me just say two things about the founding of our institution. First, it was done in part to scale up our financing of the UN SDGs, and secondly, as a purely commercial strategy to serve our clients, both issuers and investors. And the good news is that it appears to be working. Now, in light of that, one of the key things that we focused on, so what is the J.P. Morgan Development Finance Institution? It's essentially relying upon the same development impact metrics that were originated first by the IFC, and previously, if anything, it borrowed heavily from the EBRDs as well. But then since then, we've tightened it up. We've shopped it around to various other official sector development agencies to try and get something that really kind of is credible, that makes sense, that people can get aligned behind. Fast forward 3 years. We were kind of proving the concept internally to see if our clients valued it, and we had some special surprises. First, we found that our issuer clients really valued it because it helped them describe what they're going to do with other people's money. In effect, it provided an accountability mechanism that was useful to their own governance structures. Secondly, and this is always where we thought the real value was going to be, is that it would help us capture, for the sake of our issuer clients, the growing demand by investor clients to capture a double bottom line. That is, they wanted the financial returns, but they also wanted to do something useful for the world. And I think that's increasing phenomenon. You see that at JP Morgan, you see it at asset managers all over the world, and it's not just the specialists, but we think that there is an enormous pool of capital out there that really wants to do good with the money that they're investing, whilst at the same time not sacrificing returns. Okay? So based on this, oh, and the third reason is that we thought that it would make us a better, faster, cheaper partner with the official sector development agencies. Now, we've kind of made lots of friends with the development finance institutions and the multilateral development banks, but I can't say that we do that many deals with them. The vast majority of what we do is purely private. Now, fast forward 3 years, we decided that ultimately what we're really trying to do is to create an asset class, that the best way to attract the trillions of dollars that are on the sidelines available from institutional investors that are available to be put to work for development-related purposes was that you had to have a credible, quantifiable, and appropriate standard that is generally acceptable, that is measurable, that is testable, and that can be packaged ideally. Okay? So we formed a task force with, I think we now have 67 participants, 37 of whom wish to be named. And we have some members of the task force sitting at the table, to create standards that would be generally acceptable in the market. Our underlying objective was that we wanted to short-circuit the process that took 12 years for the green bond market to kind of settle behind, that we wanted to do it within a year. And I'm glad to say that actually we're on track. So we have this task force to develop first standards that are generally acceptable, and I shouldn't say standards so much as guidelines. Ultimately, it will evolve into something that we think will be more or less a standard, but we don't want to be too dirigiste in our approach right now. And these guidelines are, just to kind of point out some of the highlights. First, this is focused on how does this company or government or this institution, how does it contribute to the UN SDGs? One or more of the 17. That's one. Second, by virtue of the fact that it's focused on impact in achieving the SDGs, it has to be associated with, well, what are the gaps within that country or within the environment where the company, the geography where the company is operating, such that it makes a difference. Thirdly, it's an output and outcomes focused approach, in the sense that use of proceeds approaches are basically, you have a list of projects that are eligible to be financed with the financing that's done. Our approach, or this emerging approach that's coming about through this task force, is focused on outputs and outcomes. That is, what actually happens with the money. And then finally, I think it's also worth saying that the second objective is that we have a uniform platform where the data that's created by all of this issuance into to the capital markets or into the loan markets can all be aggregated and accumulated on one platform that people will have access to and be able to use. And then thirdly is that we are figuring out ways within this task force to generate a multiplicity of providers that are really necessary to slice and dice the data, to analyze it, to help issuers make use of these standards so that their instruments that they issue will be more, there'll be greater appetite for them by the investor public. And other kinds of research and other sorts of services that inevitably will be required if there's to be an asset class, just like there is in other asset classes in the capital markets. This task force just issued the draft guidelines at the spring meetings of IMF World Bank last week. We're open now to the public comment period. We would urge you to look up Sustainable Investment Disclosure Task Force. On the web, you'll find it. And if you have some commentary, we'd be very interested in seeing what you have to say. By the way, if you're representing some commercial firm that might have a role in this, we'd also urge you to get in touch because we think it's very valuable for you to see if there's any business opportunities for you in doing it. And let me stop there, Sherry, and I'm sure that we'll leave time for Q&A later.
Right, we'll have time. So a lot of really interesting ideas and thoughts and what you're doing and things to definitely continue to discuss. But first, let's go to our fourth panelist. And now we've gone from the question of looking at the development banks and development institutions to looking at a specific company. So I'm going to introduce now Mr. Maher Al-Hafar, who is the CFO of CEMEX.
Thank you very much, Sherry, and thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you and to share the podium with such illustrious folks. And CEMEX, just for those of you who don't know, we're one of the larger building companies around the world. We happen to be also clients of yours as well. We're very proud of that. But more importantly, I want to put a plug for the United Nations Global Compact Coalition, CFO Coalition, which we are members of, founding members of, actually. And what we were kind of one of the first guys to join there because it was a very good forum, frankly, to encourage the flow of private capital into the SDGs. And currently we have 70 founding members. We're aspiring to have 100 and maybe expanding it to about 1,000 CFOs around the world. And we're very pleased to also say that the latest numbers that we've seen in terms of capital that has been invested by the CFO Coalition is close to $350 billion out of a goal of about $500 billion. And this is, by the way, only from, I think, around 30 to 40 companies that are reporting. Many companies have not been able to actually report, so I think that the number could be even bigger. And that is an excellent platform, frankly, in getting CFOs that manage to specific targets to access the capital markets. And I think from our perspective, a few things already have been mentioned here in terms of attracting private capital to this market. First, in our view, we think that probably 5 or 10 years from now, it will not be a specialized market. We think that eventually, if things are going right in the world and alignment is at its, I don't want to say at its peak, but gets higher than where it is today, if you're not aligned with SDGs and if you're not investing in SDGs and if you're not watching what you're doing in terms of climate change, you simply won't have access to the capital markets, or you will be priced out of the capital markets. So I think it's very important that we approach this from a long-term perspective and trying to, from our perspective at least, to approach the market as we did probably 75 or 100 years ago when we started putting in financial covenants on borrowers from the markets. We strongly believe in turning a lot of these commitments that companies are making into covenant-like structures to make them uniform, to make them auditable, to make them standard around the world, have regulation that is fairly homogeneous around markets. Capital markets don't have boundaries today more than ever, and hopefully, again, as the world continue, those boundaries will come down and capital flows will move across. And I think investors, and we have made probably one of the most ambitious commitment in our sector in terms of aligning our debt stack to SDGs. We've made a commitment by 25 to achieve 50%. We're actually ahead of that. And we made a commitment that is probably the most ambitious, 85% of our debt stack aligned to SDG KPIs. And we're very comfortable that we should achieve that. Why did we do that? Because we think, companies and corporates should put, their money where their mouth is, frankly, and make sure that we are aligned and we have a material cost for not adhering to the, either decarbonization, whatever SDG metrics that you've shared with the market. So I think, I don't want to take too much more time and maybe go to the Q&A. We really believe that one of the best ways to attract capital to this asset class is to make sure that it's profitable, to make sure that it's measurable, traceable, it's fairly consistent across, so that also investors and banks don't feel that they are taking risk when they are, inordinate risk, I should say, when they are investing in a company or financing a company that has made certain commitments about their SDG KPIs and roadmaps. And so I would like to close with that. And
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. We're going to open the floor for questions. And oh yeah, please go ahead. And is it possible to turn the light on or not? Oh, it is. Okay, so yeah, go ahead.
Good afternoon, Sherry. How are you? And all the esteemed panelists. My name is Gail Davis. I am part of the NGO Committee on Finance for Development when I sit on climate finance as a volunteer. I had a question for the panel. If you're dealing from a country point of view, okay, and you're looking to, how does that work with the investments, let's say for these investments or impact investments or what we're talking about for infrastructure, let's say that's needed in a African country where they need the infrastructure of roads and roads and let's say solar panels and all these types of things so that the country is able to support itself in the rural areas to have access to the things that they need. It's not just a matter of giving money, but a matter of that money being, maybe they can invest some way so that they can have those roads built so that large private sector companies can come in to do the construction. I'd love to know if that's possible or if I'm just really far off in the question that I'm asking.
Thanks. And I think maybe, Dan, we would start with you to give some examples.
Well, I think that your question points to one of the toughest issues about getting sustainable finance into the emerging and frontier markets, and that is project size. Now, there's other considerations, like, the two of the big structural barriers are, one, the perception that there's more risk, whether it's credit, market, political, regulatory risk, or just information barriers. People don't know those markets so that they assume there's more risk. So that's one important barrier. And I think that the official sector institutions, as well as the governments themselves that work day in and day out on these issues are vital for that purpose. But there's also some, shall I call them technical barriers, and that is that project size tends to be small. And because project size is small, they tend not to attract the interest of the JP Morgans of the world, nor institutional investors. So one of the virtues of these standards that we're trying to create industry-wide is that it's focused on the enterprise or government itself, which almost by definition is much bigger. We're hoping that that will facilitate flows of capital to institutional investors or intermediaries like ourselves that otherwise wouldn't concentrate on the sustainable finance opportunity. And we think that that's going to happen, and it is happening.
Great. Thank you. Zamir, from your side?
Thank you. I think very good question. I think this is where the MDBs come in for various reasons. First of all, MDBs have engaged with the country, especially in Africa, for a long time. Most of the African countries are the members of either the World Bank or African Development Bank or the Islamic Development Bank. They have a long history of experience of project finance, and that's where the MDBs can help the member country, that particular country with the capacity building and the project preparation to make sure that the project is viable and how it could be presented to the private sector for their interest. Second thing is, with Daniel mentioned about the project size. So that's where the MDBs can play a role, that they could have these small projects in many countries, but they can pool them. They can pool them and go to the capital market and the global capital market and say that, look, we have these projects and these are all doing well, and these needs to be the pipeline. Please, let's issue a bond, a sustainability bond, or SDG bond, and let's mobilize some private capital for that purpose. So I think MDB can play a very vital role, and now that all the MDBs were trying to work as a one system, I think there's much more opportunities that this system could work and become much more efficient and quite agile and quite effective. Thank you.
Thanks. Can I ask a question on that? So when you say to issue the SDG bond, who do you see as the issuer of those bonds?
Well, as I said, we as a MDB can issue by pooling all these projects and go to the market. Now, the question is whether the private sector is interested in that, at that margin. Then yes, if not, then we have to go and find someone who's willing to either subsidize or come as a donor for that particular reason. So it all depends on different cases. There has been so much innovation done more recently, last couple of years. I think that we have many instruments at our hand which we could use. And again, I really commend JP Morgan for taking that initiative. And I understand they have done quite successful transactions. And we are actually working with them, trying to innovate more. And I am very optimistic that we could innovate some real good solution for, at the end of the day, for these developing countries.
Right. No, that's great. I was wondering, is it the risk of your bank and it's on your bank's balance sheet, or is it, are you talking about somehow either doing a separate entity that issues the SDG bonds?
Well, yes, if we end up financing the project, then it will be on our balance sheet. Other way is that we can also participate as in a PPP project, which could be then done. So it all depends on how. The third, I think the way I mentioned about this, the platform which is initiated by the World Bank, this and signed by many MDBs, that platform could pool money from both MDBs as well as the private sector, and later on pool them together, securitize or whatever, and then issue the bond.
Interesting. Okay, we'll see if we get to that point. So, Adama, from your perspective, thanks.
Yeah, I think this is a typical, if we had to make a case of how we work as a system, MDBs, national development banks, the private sector, and the companies that are investing on this kind of project, let's say infrastructure project. First of all, I was, mentioning the development banks. If you look at the repartition of the capital of the development banks today, we take these 500 and plus public development banks. They represent globally 20 trillion of assets they have on their balance sheet. 80% of the total asset is concentrated in the G20 countries. If you take Africa, for example, you have 100 banks, public development banks, more or less. They represent only 1% of the total development, of the total balance sheet of the public development banks. That shows that they are rather small in the economic space, but it's also showing the opportunity they can play in the development of the national countries. So that's why I was, mentioning earlier, we should think beyond the role that the international financial institutions are playing, being MDBs or bilateral institutions like myself. So I'm based within AFD, the French Development Agency. Those represent only 10% of the public development banks in the world. The rest of them work in their national ground, in their countries. So if we take this case of the country that has a project and how we mobilize on this project, often we hear the private sector saying, either we don't have enough projects or enough good projects. So we hear that a lot. Or there is too much risk, let's de-risk us, etc., etc. But in which point, us as international financial institutions are involving our peers as national development banks that know way better what's going on in their countries. And if we help them to have more capacity in building in this national level, the pipeline of projects. They can be the tools that originate projects and prepare projects in their own countries. So I'm not saying that all those banks are wonderful and well-governed, et cetera, but matter of fact, they exist. And they went beyond the crisis we have seen. So if we think at this community of public development bank as obviously an asset class, where we have access as international IFIs to the market, so pooling resources from the private sector or the central banks, et cetera, and investing it in developing areas, we are moving the money. Actually, we are mobilizing private sector somehow. So that's why I'm interested in this discussion. So we differentiate the project level, which is really development-oriented, and the financial level where there is more trillions being moved from private sector, channeled by the development banks into the development world as concessional finance. So that's why I think also, if we take this African example, there is, of course, there is some fragmentation on the regulation space, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where also we should help those governments in having the capacity through the public development banks in investing. So that's complementary, I think.
Thank you. And there's actually an interest, before going to a question for Dan, building on that. So there's been talk of how national development banks, because they're on the ground, when we talk about finding bankable projects or projects that may eventually become bankable, that the national development banks, because of their knowledge of the national system of the country, may be best placed, especially ones with SDG impact that are aligned to the country's priorities. And so have you done any deals working at all with national development banks yet? And what are some of those examples? And then, I'm sorry, then we'll go.
Absolutely. And no, I wouldn't go as far as you just did. I'd say that national development banks are critically important partners. But I also think that companies like CEMEX are important partners. I mean, we don't do development. We do development finance. CEMEX does development because they are investing, they are hiring people, they're manufacturing critical supplies for the construction industry. So they are like foreign direct investors that are supporting the development process. What we haven't got so far in the private sector and what we're striving to do is to have metrics so that we at JP Morgan can rightly call ourselves development financiers and that our clients like CEMEX can rightly call themselves agents of development, because they are.
And so maybe the next, when we finish this, let's get back to the metrics in 1 second, but over to, yes.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very good segue, by what you just mentioned, because I think it would be very interesting to take a look at corporates in all of our geographies as distributors of credit. Yeah. To give you an example, for instance, very recently we worked with a multinational bank in Mexico. Our headquarters and our biggest market it happens to be in Mexico. And we set up a facility to fund women owner suppliers, for instance. We know that one of the biggest challenges in all markets, but particularly emerging markets, is access to working capital, and access to working capital and funding for small and medium-sized enterprises, particularly small enterprises. And so one of the SDGs that we're committed to is diversity, and one of the things that we are very committed to is developing women in all of our markets and within our company very, very critically. And so we actually worked and we set up a facility for $150 million to be granted on preferential basis to women owners of our supply chain, of elements of our supply chain. And we're looking, frankly, at partners. We're looking at banks, additional banks. In fact, I just told one of my people that is focused on that, I said, we want you to go out and talk to all of the, international banks and development banks to see how we can get them to partner up with us so we can actually distribute that credit within, and Mexico is just the beginning. So that's just one way that we can certainly work.
So could I ask a question about that? So clearly these are to women who are users of your products.
Yes.
And it's at concessional rates.
Yeah.
So does that come out of, are you paying the concessional difference, or where is that coming, or is it coming out of a different pot of your
Yeah,
money?
first, it's not women that are buying our products. These are business women that are supplying
Right, okay,
us
right,
for
but-
our
right,
supply
okay,
chain,
right,
right?
right,
Which
right.
is
So
which
with
is
your
important.
supply-
We do have
apologies,
another
yeah.
we do have another program which is for communities to help them fund build homes. But that's not the issue. And there's no concession. I mean, the concession is that we are indirectly putting our balance sheet and putting our knowledge of our suppliers on the table with the international bank that is working with us, or national bank that is working with us, because we lend a lot of credibility. I mean, these guys know, for instance, that we've been working with this supplier for many years. So that's kind of what we bring to the table, which is very powerful.
And likewise, we don't have any appetite to face CEMEX's suppliers or their customers, but they can act as a distributor of some of the financial capability that we have,
Exactly,
such
yeah.
as risk management and raising capital in the first place.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
So are there any other questions? I think that we only have a few more minutes. If there are no questions, I wonder if we could, oh, yes, go ahead.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon. My name is Valentin Calqui Camano Rivera for Man Up Campaign Mexico chapter. And one of my questions is, I am from Mexico and I have seen the results that you have been implying, which is very successful. How can that be replicated in other regions in rural areas such as entrepreneurship, women leadership, and limited resources like the one of the Mexican banks, like for example, BBVA, as you may be aware, it's a local bank in Mexico. How can collaborations or MOUs be implemented in rural municipalities all across the board in the Republic of Mexico? That would be my question. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, this is something that we just started, I think we announced it like a few months ago, right? And again, without mentioning the name of the bank, but, I think it's very easy. I think going to other institutions, and I think getting a partnership between private and public financing institutions would even be more powerful. I mean, if we can get some of you folks up here on the public side that join up with private side and us as an issuer, that would be really powerful. And the other thing that we can do also, and we're doing it through the CFO Coalition, is working with other companies in Mexico, for instance, who are either members of the CFO Coalition or who are friends of ours, and we share with them what we're doing with the CFO Coalition, that could potentially do similar and need to do similar financing for their supply chain, whether it's suppliers or whether it's receivables or whether it's working capital or whatever. And I think we would be more than happy, frankly, to be an anchor of that conversation because of our own self-benefit, but also as part of our CFO Coalition role to kind of share with other CFOs and other private sector companies. But I totally agree that I think that companies like us are in much more privileged position to understand credit risk than large international banks or large national banks, for that matter, when it comes to this smaller sized, medium-sized enterprises.
And have you been doing supplier financing for a long time, though?
Absolutely,
Right, yeah,
absolutely.
right. So
And
it's just
we,
that it's focusing now on women, for example.
Actually, we have used SDG-aligned KPIs with derivatives, with receivable securitizations, with supplier credits, with term loans, and I mean, it's been
Right,
across.
right.
We've been trying to do it in every part of the capital markets because we believe that this is not just project finance. I mean, you have to address what is most needed in that market. It may not be project finance. It may be shorter-term working capital.
So we have one last question, which is for you, sir. What is the role of Islamic finance to unlock a new pool of capital in frontier markets?
Thank you. I'm glad you asked this question. Just to give a flavor that Islamic financial markets are exceeding at least $3.2 trillion. And these markets have huge liquidity available, and they are seeking for good investment opportunities. And I think that's where what we believe that if there are some innovative solutions where we could structure the transaction which are meeting the demands of Islamic law, then that particular liquidity can be tapped. And that's, again, we as a institution which practices Islamic finance has every year almost we issue 5 billion worth of bonds, and that's indicate that there is a market out there, and there is actually quite excess liquidity in the market which needs to be tapped, and they're very also very focused on sustainability agenda as part of their investment objectives.
Great, thank you so much. So this was a very quick panel to just get us started, and thank you so much to all of the panelists for your very insightful ideas and thoughts. And I'm going to pass the floor to my colleague Mary Angela, who will give a little bit of a scope of what's coming in the fair for the rest of the week.
Thank you so much, Harry, and thank you. Thank you all. So this was... Thank you so much. So this was the opening, and we're really, really pleased with the level and participation, and online. We're very, very happy. So this afternoon, we will have a session on guidance for SDG sovereign bonds and different bonds, thematic bonds, that will take place at 4:30 in conference room 8, sorry. And then tomorrow, we will start again at 3 in the afternoon with presentations from countries. And then on Thursday, we will continue the session with a early morning session at 8:30. It will be happening in the Ford Foundation, so I hope you all got your passes and registration for that. And then we will have more presentations on Thursday. And there will be a session, a workshop, on Friday online. We will have this evening at 7 a reception with invitation only, and we will have also on Thursday the closing at the Turkey mission. Thank you so much, and very, very happy to have such a great start for the fair. Thank you.